There was a moment when Adolf Hitler was warned. It was not dramatic. There were no explosions in the background, no generals shouting, just a map, a simple map of southern Russia, and a line stretching too far. In the summer of 1942, Germany was winning, or at least it felt that way. France had fallen in weeks. Poland was crushed, the Balkans subdued, Ukraine burning under occupation. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun the year before like a lightning strike. The Wehrmacht had torn through Soviet defenses with terrifying speed. Entire Soviet armies were encircled, hundreds of thousands captured. It looked unstoppable. But here is the strange part. It wasn't over. The Soviet Union didn't collapse. It bent. It retreated. It absorbed the blow and kept breathing. By mid-1942, Hitler believed he understood the war better than his generals. He no longer listened the same way. Victories had done something to him. They had made him certain that instinct mattered more than logistics, certain that willpower mattered more than fuel, certain that destiny was on his side. So instead of concentrating forces toward Moscow, he split his army. That decision, almost casual on paper, changed everything. Army Group A would go south toward the Caucasus oil fields. Army Group B would push toward a city on the Volga River, a city that strategically mattered but symbolically mattered more. Stalingrad. The name alone irritated him. Stalin's city. It was not just about supply lines. It became personal. And when war becomes personal, reason begins to fade. German generals warned him. The front was stretching dangerously thin. Supply lines were fragile. Winter would come again. The Soviet manpower reserves were larger than expected, but Hitler saw a weakness in the enemy. He believed one more push would break them, one more decisive strike, one more humiliation. So the Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was ordered towards Stalingrad. At first, the advance looked familiar, fast, confident, overwhelming. Luftwaffe bombers reduced parts of the city to rubble. Entire districts turned to ash. Civilians were buried alive beneath collapsing buildings. Smoke darkened the sky for days. From above, it looked like victory. But something strange was happening on the ground. The destruction made things worse. The ruins created cover. The shattered buildings became fortresses. The city did not fall. It hardened. Soviet soldiers began fighting room by room, stairwell by stairwell, factory by factory. They called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. You could control the top floor of a building, and the Soviets would control the basement. You could secure a street in the morning and lose it by nightfall. Snipers hid in broken walls. Machine guns fired from shattered windows. At one point, German and Soviet soldiers were so close. Grenades were more useful than rifles. And yet, Hitler refused to see this as a warning. He believed the city was on the verge of collapse. He believed the Soviets were exhausted. He believed time favored Germany. But time was doing something else. The Volga River remained open. At night, Soviet reinforcements crossed the water under artillery fire. More men, more ammunition, more resistance. And here's the real tension. The Germans were winning tactically, block by block. But strategically, they were being pulled deeper, further into the ruins, further from supply, further from flexibility. And then something even more dangerous happened. The flanks, the sides of the German advance, were not protected by elite German divisions. They were guarded by Romanian and Italian units. Under-equipped, underprepared, stretched thin, the city consumed attention. But outside the city, the trap was forming. And the strange part? Some German officers sensed it. They could feel something tightening. But Hitler could not, or would not, because to retreat from Stalingrad would mean admitting that destiny had limits. And dictators do not retreat easily. They double down. And Stalingrad was about to test how far doubling down could go, because what was coming was not another street battle. It was something colder, bigger, and irreversible. By October 1942, Stalingrad no longer looked like a city. It looked like the surface of the moon. Factories reduced to skeletons of steel. Apartment blocks hollowed out. Streets erased. The Germans controlled nearly 90% of it. That number matters, because if you control 90% of a city, you should be winning. And yet, the Volga still flowed. Soviet troops still crossed it at night. German units were exhausted. Street fighting is not like open field warfare. There are no front lines, no clear advances. Every wall hides a threat. Every pile of rubble is a position. And here's where the pattern begins to feel strange. The Sixth Army kept pushing forward, but it wasn't gaining freedom. It was losing it. The deeper they went into Stalingrad, the more compressed they became. The city swallowed maneuverability. Tanks became useless in narrow streets. Air superiority meant less when the enemy was 10 meters away. Artillery flattened buildings, but the rubble became Soviet cover. And still, Berlin demanded speed. Take the city, finish it, raise the flag. Hitler's headquarters believed the Red Army was close to collapse. They saw Soviet casualties. They saw retreats. They interpreted desperation as weakness. But something subtle was happening beyond the city limits. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov was not focused on saving every building. He was focused on something else. Encirclement. The German Sixth Army was concentrated inside Stalingrad, but its flanks, long exposed, fragile, were protected by Axis allies. Romanian divisions guarding hundreds of kilometers. Poorly equipped, few anti-tank weapons, low morale, and winter was coming. The Soviet High Command called the plan Operation Uranus. It sounds almost clinical. It was anything but. On November 19, 1942, the sky cracked open. Thousands of Soviet artillery pieces fired simultaneously, not inside Stalingrad, but against the flanks, against the Romanians, against the weakest points. Within hours, entire defensive lines collapsed. Soviet armored divisions poured through the gaps. This was not a small counterattack. This was a full strategic maneuver. And here's the chilling part. Inside Stalingrad, many German officers did not immediately understand what was happening. They were still fighting building to building, still trying to capture factories, still believing victory was close. But outside, the ring was closing. By November 23rd, Soviet forces met near the town of Kalik. The circle was complete. Nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped, encircled, cut off, no direct supply routes, no retreat corridors, just a shrinking pocket of freezing ruins. General Paulus sent urgent messages to Berlin. The situation was serious. Fuel was low, ammunition finite, food already rationed. The logical move? Break out immediately, before Soviet forces tightened further, before winter deepened, before supplies ran out. But logic was no longer the primary force guiding decisions. Hitler refused retreat. The Sixth Army was to hold its ground, stand fast, not one step back. He promised the Luftwaffe would supply the army by air. He believed airlift capacity was sufficient. It wasn't. To survive, the Sixth Army needed around 700 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe could barely deliver a fraction of that, and that was in good weather. Winter had arrived. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze. Lubricants thickened. Wounded men stiffened in trenches. Horses collapsed in the snow. Food dwindled. Fuel disappeared. And here is where the tension becomes unbearable. The soldiers trapped inside Stalingrad did not know yet how doomed they were. They believed relief was coming. They believed reinforcements were assembling. They believed Berlin had a plan. Because how could the High Command not? But the Soviet ring tightened. Artillery pounded the pocket. Airfields were shelled. Medical supplies vanished. Men began burning furniture for warmth. Then books. Then anything. Frostbite cases rose. Ammunition was rationed carefully. The once confident Sixth Army now existed inside a frozen bowl of rubble. And still, Hitler refused breakout. He feared the symbolic loss more than the military loss. Stalingrad had become a statement, a test of will, and he believed willpower alone could defy physics. But war does not respond to pride. It responds to logistics. And slowly, quietly, Inevitably, the pocket shrank. Inside, the soldiers began asking a question they were afraid to say aloud. Had we been abandoned? But no one dared answer, because the truth was colder than the Russian winter, and it was only just beginning. December arrived without mercy. The snow did not fall gently. It swallowed. The German Sixth Army was now trapped inside what soldiers began calling the Kessel, the cauldron, a frozen bowl of ruins. No fuel, almost no food, limited ammunition, and temperatures that could kill a man in his sleep. At first, rations were reduced quietly, a slice of bread, thin soup, horse meat when available. Soon, horses disappeared, then dogs, then anything remotely edible. Men who months earlier had marched across Europe in confidence were now fighting over frozen scraps. Frostbite cases multiplied, fingers blackened, toes amputated without proper anesthesia. Medical tents were overwhelmed. Morphine was scarce. Bandages were reused. And still Berlin insisted, hold your ground. The promised airlift became a cruel illusion. Transport planes tried. Some were shot down. Others landed on makeshift airstrips under artillery fire. Most deliveries were insufficient. Fuel was prioritized over food. Ammunition over medicine. Men began burning parts of their own equipment just to stay warm. Wooden rifle stocks, crates, broken furniture from destroyed buildings. And yet the front lines did not disappear. They tightened. Soviet artillery grew heavier, more precise. The Red Army sensed weakness. They knew time was their ally. Inside the pocket, morale fractured. Some officers still believed relief forces would break through. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had launched Operation Winterstorm, an attempt to reach the encircled army. For a brief moment, hope flickered. German radio messages spoke of rescue. Men whispered in trenches, "They're coming. They're close." But they were not close enough. Manstein's forces stalled under fierce Soviet resistance. Fuel shortages limited movement. And once again, Hitler forbade breakout attempts from inside the pocket. The Sixth Army was to stay, to wait, to endure. General Friedrich Paulus found himself in an impossible position. He was a disciplined officer, obedient, methodical, but now he commanded an army dissolving in slow motion. He requested permission to break out, denied. He warned of collapse, ignored. He asked for clarity, silence. The truth was unbearable. Berlin feared the political consequences, a withdrawal more than the military consequences of annihilation. And so the men remained. As Christmas approached, something almost surreal happened. Chaplains held small services inside ruins. Carols were whispered. Some soldiers received delayed letters from home. Wives writing about children learning to walk. Mothers sending prayers. Fathers speaking of pride. Many of those letters would never receive a reply, because by January, the situation had turned catastrophic. The Soviets launched Operation Ring. This was not encirclement. This was reduction. Artillery pounded the pocket relentlessly. The German perimeter shrank day by day. Airfields were overrun. Supply flights nearly ceased. Wounded soldiers lay in freezing basements, stacked side by side. Some died quietly during the night. Others begged for evacuation that would never come. Hunger became something deeper than pain. It became a dull, constant presence. Men grew skeletal. Uniforms hung loose. Eyes hollow. There are accounts of soldiers writing final notes in diaries. Tell my mother I fought bravely. I am not afraid. I am just tired. Some units stopped functioning as coherent forces. Communication lines broke. Officers lost control. Small groups fought independently. And through it all, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. That promotion carried a message. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was an expectation disguised as honor. Fight to the last man. Die if necessary. But do not surrender. Paulus understood the implication. The Soviets were now inside the city itself, dividing the pocket into smaller sections. German resistance was fierce in places, desperate, but increasingly fragmented. What had begun as a confident advance into Soviet territory had transformed into survival inside a tomb of ice and rubble. And here's the emotional core. These were not abstract numbers. These were young men, cold, starving, waiting, believing for months that their leadership would not abandon them, and slowly realizing they had been sacrificed to pride. By late January 1943, ammunition was nearly gone, food non-existent, medical supplies exhausted. The question was no longer, can we win? It was, how much longer can we endure? And in Berlin, Hitler still spoke of resolve, still believed in miracle reversals, still imagined that willpower could bend reality. But Stalingrad was no longer a battlefield. It was a reckoning, and it was about to end, not with a breakthrough, not with a heroic rescue, but with something Germany had not experienced on this scale before: total collapse. 10 years earlier, Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. Now, a decade into his rise to power, his Sixth Army was dying in Stalingrad. On that same day, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. It sounded like an honor. It was not. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: die or win, but do not surrender. Inside Stalingrad, Paulus sat in a basement headquarters surrounded by maps that no longer mattered. There were no reinforcements coming, no fuel for maneuver, no ammunition for a final stand, no food, no medical capacity, just fragments of divisions, tens of thousands of starving, freezing soldiers, and the Red Army tightening its grip. By now, Soviet troops had split the German pocket into two separate groups, northern and southern sectors. Communication was collapsing. Officers could no longer coordinate effectively. Some units were fighting with fewer than 100 men. The Luftwaffe had failed. The relief attempt had failed. The promises had failed. The illusion had failed. On January 31st, 1943, Soviet forces reached Paulus' headquarters. He was found in a cellar, exhausted, unshaven, wearing the uniform of a field marshal who had been promoted days earlier. He did not shoot himself. He did not stage a last stand. He surrendered. When news reached Berlin, Hitler was furious. He had expected suicide. Instead, he received reality. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the remaining northern pocket surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers had been encircled. Of those, around 90,000 were captured. Only about 5,000 would ever return home from Soviet captivity. The rest died from cold, from starvation, from disease, from exhaustion. It was the first complete destruction of a German field army. Not a retreat, not a setback, an annihilation. The psychological shock was enormous. Until Stalingrad, the German army had seemed unstoppable. Even defeats felt temporary. But this was different. For the first time, the myth cracked. The aura of invincibility shattered. The Soviet Union had not just offended, it had broken one of Hitler's most powerful armies. The tide had turned, not in a single explosion, not in a dramatic cinematic moment, but in months of attrition, of overconfidence, of refusal to adapt. After Stalingrad, the Red Army would never stop advancing west. Course would follow, then relentless offensives. Berlin would eventually fall, and if you trace the thread backward, you can find its turning point in the frozen ruins of that city on the Volga. But here is the deeper truth. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It was a failure of leadership. Hitler had believed in will over logistics, symbolism over strategy, pride over prudence. He split his forces when concentration was needed. He refused retreat when flexibility was essential. He ignored warnings, and he sacrificed an entire army to preserve an image. And that is the strange part. The battle that broke Hitler did not break him immediately. He continued the war. He continued issuing orders. He continued believing in final victory. But something fundamental had shifted. From that winter onward, Germany was fighting against inevitability. And inevitability is patient. The soldiers who froze in Stalingrad were not defeated only by Soviet artillery. They were defeated by distance, by supply shortages, by weather, by encirclement, and by a leader who mistook stubbornness for strength. When the last German radio transmission from Stalingrad was sent, it did not speak of glory. It spoke of silence. And silence is what followed. In the end, Stalingrad proved something brutally simple. War does not forgive arrogance. It does not reward pride. It punishes miscalculation. And sometimes, the moment you refuse to step back is the moment you step into collapse. If you ever wonder when the Third Reich truly began to fall, it was not in Berlin in 1945. It was not on the beaches of Normandy. It was in the winter of 1942, in a city reduced to ash and ice, where an army waited for rescue and realized too late that no one was coming.